Hello and welcome to another episode of The Practical Side. Today joining me is a special guest, Anirudh Rao. Hello Anirudh, welcome to The Practical Side.
Thanks, hello. Thanks for having me.
So before we go ahead, let me introduce Anirudh to you. Anirudh is a lawyer and he's presently based out of London. Anirudh has done his bachelor's in law from Bangalore University, master's from George Washington University in the US, and Anirudh has a great experience of working with the World Bank, Infosys, and presently is working with Cognizant. And the topic for today is about contracts. As you know, on the practical side, we discuss different aspects of law with experts on how you can learn the practical side and also practice this in the future. And the discussion for this episode, Anirudh, is all about contracts, and since you work with Cognizant and you're specializing in contracts, most of the audience here are students who are studying the company secretary course and also the LLB course. We'll discuss about the contracts and your experience of drafting contracts, vetting contracts, negotiating different contracts. So the first thing is, what kind of role do you play? If somebody asks you what do you do, so what would be your answer to them in a short sentence?
Sure. So I'm a contract transactional lawyer, and I have been so for the past 8 years now. And my primary responsibility is to draft, negotiate, and vet contracts. And that essentially means that I take the company through the full cycle of looking at a contract and identifying risks, or drafting contract from scratch by taking into account various aspects of what is required for that transaction.
Okay, so as Anirudh shared, that is the entire life cycle of a contract right from the time it comes into the company till it is signed off on the dotted line. And all of you are also studying the Indian Contract Act at the various levels of your exam, and that is one of the most important piece of legislation for your skills to develop contract drafting and negotiating skills in the future. So that is the theory. Now we'll understand with Anirudh about what are the kind of contracts he deals with and what is his role and what your role can be tomorrow if you want to do this. So Anirudh, talking about the kind of contracts, and you work with a big software giant, what kind of contracts does a big company deal with? Like a range of contracts, you can name a few.
Sure. So we deal with anything from an NDA to a letter of intent, an LOI, to an MOU, memorandum of understanding, to a master services agreement or a licensing agreement, and everything in between. So they vary in degrees of complexity and volume, and every single contract has a different approach that you need to take in order to get it across the line.
Okay. So as you were talking about the different kinds of contract, right from what we would call a simple NDA or a non-disclosure agreement to master service agreement, what are the jurisdiction that you're dealing with? Of course, now you're based out of London, but is it just the English law there, or because Cognizant or Infosys, these kind of companies have multiple locations? So what is the jurisdiction?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you hit the nail on the head. So most larger companies like Cognizant, they have a global footprint. So despite the fact that I'm geographically located in London, I don't necessarily deal only with English law contracts. I look at contracts from across the globe, whether it's US law or even civil law jurisdictions, including Germany, France, Spain, or even sort of somewhere as far afield as Singapore. Okay. So there is that expectation from you as a lawyer to have an overarching view of jurisdictions from across the globe.
Yeah, so there is a huge opportunity for you people watching that if you were to equip yourself in the area of contracts, you can work with companies where you have multiple jurisdiction. Even if you're based out of London or Bangalore or Chennai, it really doesn't matter. So talking about that, like you said, there were quite a few challenges in terms of jurisdiction and stuff like that. One basic question is, what kind of skills are required? One is the theory of knowing the basics of the law. But when you're dealing with multiple contracts and multiple jurisdictions, what skills are required for someone who wants to probably emulate what you have done?
I think the first thing that you have to keep in mind is just attention to detail. Especially with contracting, there's a myriad of issues that you deal with, from intellectual property to data protection to and everything in between. In order for you to be a good contracting lawyer, the first thing that you'd need to have is a nuanced understanding of all of these issues, and how to sort of express them from a contractual perspective. And another thing that you need to bear in mind is the first thing that you need, or rather the first thing you need to bear in mind is attention, that with regards to a contract you need to have certainty. So a badly drafted contract has the potential effect of putting your company at risk should it go into litigation.
So here one thing which actually I caught when Anirudh was speaking was attention to detail, and that goes with any law for that matter, but definitely with contracts in particular. And as a student of corporate law, you study security laws and you study economic laws. Even there, attention to detail is most important. In fact, I'd just like to share, one of a very senior legal counsel in a company was talking to me, and he said role of a CS or a legal counsel or a dual role is more like a pilot. You can't afford to make even one mistake, because if a pilot were to say I did 99 things right and only did one mistake, it will be quite a costly mistake like that.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure that's pretty similar to what you're saying. So you said attention to detail, nuance, and knowing about the certainty, and definitely your core technical skills is there. But for someone who's watching it, and the whole purpose of our show is that there's a huge gap between what we are studying and what we actually work, and we are trying to bridge that gap, or at least start bridging that gap with this show. How do you think a student who's studying law or CS or CA or any course for that matter, how can they equip themselves over a period of time to acquire these skills like what you're doing?
I think the biggest teacher with a lot of with a lot of things is experience. Personally for me, when I graduated from law school and I looked at my first contract, I had no clue what I was doing, because the kind of things that you study in law school and then sort of its practical application,
yes,
there's a huge gap in between. With regards to contracts, I think that's something that you sort of pick up over time. But as a student, what I would advise is, if you can have a look at sort of publicly available contracts. For example, Facebook, you've got an acceptable user policy, or even if you were to buy an iPhone,
agreements in any kind of softwares or tools which we use.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So even sort of when you were to buy a new iPhone, you need to sort of scroll down terms and conditions and just click agree. Like everyone else, I just scroll all the way down and just click I accept. But if this is something that you want to do, what I would implore a student to do is just have a look at how the clauses there are drafted and what is it that they're trying to achieve, and that's definitely held me in good stead.
Okay, so in fact, again, one thing which you should really draw attention to when Anirudh was speaking was that when he was just out of law school, he said when he saw the first contract, he was not very confident with it, and this is what I want you guys to understand, because now, yes, he may be working in a big corporate like Cognizant and dealing with multiple jurisdictions and based out of London, but there was a day even for someone like Anirudh where the first contract looked quite challenging. And for you guys there, because a lot of you are telling us that you bring guests and they have reached a very top position, but they were just like you and they went through the same journey and they have reached over here. So I'm sure even you can do this, and I think Anirudh has given a very good suggestion on how you can start reading up even basic contracts on Facebook, or when you buy a phone or anything else. Basically for everything there is a contract and you should know about it. So the next thing is on a day-to-day basis, on your average day, what kind of contract do you deal with, or how does your day go?
So in my role, I support what we call internally within Cognizant as MLEU. It's a vertical within Cognizant. Okay. So any client that comes out of either manufacturing, logistics, utilities, energy, and retail. So anything that comes within that vertical, I'd be responsible for. So what I do on a typical day is either advise on, let's say, data protection, our data protection obligations either under contract or under regulation, or I'd either look at a termination letter, for example, that's come from a retail client somewhere in Spain, or I'd negotiate with a client a master service agreement for the provision of IT services, or maybe even sort of negotiate a licensing agreement for the provision of a platform.
Yeah, for the benefit of our audience, if you could elaborate a little bit more about the negotiating part, like with a hypothetical situation, like what would happen? Of course, we don't want the specific details, but in general, how does it work?
So a negotiation is probably the most fun part of my job, because there is a human aspect to it.
Yes.
There is a person on the other side, and you need to read into that person's emotions. You have to engage with that person. You have to build trust, and at the end of the day, you need to build value for the company. And how you do that is by sort of really sort of understanding what the product is that you're looking to sell, and how and what the real risks are. So typically, sort of what you do in negotiation is go over certain clauses and sort of hear the other person out and understand what their priorities are and concerns are, and also sort of bear in mind what risks that you're trying to protect, and essentially draft a clause that is able to marry both these aspects.
And find the right balance between what your company wants and who you're representing and the other party, like your vendors or customers.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So I'm sure that helped with that explanation, because just the fact of negotiating, maybe our audience won't get that. So similar to that, when you say vetting, what role is there if you want to take an example?
So when I say vetting a contract, essentially it could either be sort of as an advisory capacity, where you get an internal client or an external client or whoever it is who's asking for what does this clause mean. So you're essentially trying to break it down and make someone who does not have the legal expertise or know-how, and explaining to that person what your obligations are and what your risk is,
and how it will impact them, and the entire gamut of the things which they have to comply with, and
absolutely
things like that.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So you spoke to us about vetting and about the fun part of your job, negotiating. So drafting is something even the ones who are watching here is very essential. Whether you're drafting a simple resolution in a company, or you're drafting a note to the management, or drafting a contract, drafting skills are very essential, and it's inevitable without that. So in drafting, what's your role in drafting?
Sure. So I think as a sort of as a core competency or a skill, drafting is something that you really need to develop as a lawyer, and not just if you're as a contract, a transactional lawyer, but just generally in your advisory role. That's an essential skill to have. What I typically do is, let's say, for example, on a typical day, I'd either look at a services agreement and a licensing agreement. Now, a lot of people think that they're both one and the same, but they're not. They're very different. In one, you're essentially giving the client ownership over IP. In the other one, you're essentially giving them a license to use it for a finite amount of time. So I just gave you an example of a nuance that exists, and it's important for you to pick on those issues and essentially draft a clause that is able to effectively communicate that.
Okay, so I think that example really helped, like the difference between passing on the IP in terms of ownership and then licensing it to them for a certain time, which is fixed time, and it could be a year or 5 years, or depending on the parties which negotiate. So one question, one step before things come to you. So let's say the management wants to get into an agreement with a new vendor or a new customer or a new client. So when does it come to your table? What happens before coming into your table?
Sure. So a lot of times, you sort of, as a lawyer, you tend to lose sight of all of the work that happens, behind the scenes. And typically what happens in my world is that a client would release what is called as an RFP, a request for proposal. And what they put out is their requirements of what they need from an IT perspective. Now that has operational aspects, they also put out a budget, what it is that they're willing to spend. And they also put out a contract, the terms and conditions, which will form the basis for the provision of the services. So me as a lawyer, I get involved at the RFP stage itself.
Okay.
So I get a holistic view of what the deal is going to look like, not just from a contractual perspective,
The
but
business
from a
side.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So sort of it's at that stage that you get involved, and usually at that point in time, I sort of look at what the low-hanging fruit is. Like, for example, if there are certain jurisdictions where we shouldn't be doing business, or if there are certain jurisdictions which requires further due diligence. For example, you could be working with a Unilever who has a global presence, and they've got a presence in Iran. Now, working with Iran itself may not be a problem for a lot of institutions, but then if you're a US registered company, because of
the geopolitics and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a lawyer, it's important for you to spot those issues and sort of highlight those risks beforehand.
Okay. So based on the things which you highlight, who takes the final call, and again, when does it come back to your table?
Sure. So usually sort of different companies are structured differently, but at least in the organizations that I've worked with, it's the head of the business who takes the final decision. And then sort of based on whether it's a yes or a no, or a yes but XYZ, you as a lawyer would action based on the direction that you receive.
So as we were discussing, one thing that came to me is that you have to deal with multiple jurisdictions and different laws.
Yeah.
So how do you keep yourself updated, or is it required that you should know the nuances of each country's laws? How does it work?
So I think sort of as a lawyer, you need to look at your role fairly holistically. The largest sort of nuances that you see is between common law and civil law jurisdictions.
Yes.
The common law jurisdictions being the US, India, and the UK, whereas the civil law jurisdictions, the way they work is very different. It's driven by statute rather than by stare decisis. So to answer your question, I think sort of having a general overview of how things are done in different jurisdictions is important to know. But as you sort of grow more and more senior, you don't need to know every single minutiae, because you'll have specialists that you can reach out to. For example, people transfer is a very highly regulated area. It's impossible to know every single nuance in every single jurisdiction. So you'd have specialists for that. But you need to know at a very high level what the risks are, how is it that you can address them. Yeah.
So like in taking a cue from what you said, you can't you need not have the expert knowledge on the nuances of every single jurisdiction, and you use the term as you move higher up the ladder. So taking a cue from that, where can a person with your experience and education and learning move higher up the ladder, not necessarily within the organizations but in general?
I think the first thing is, as a contract lawyer, you've got plenty of opportunities. There's always a need for contract lawyers for across the globe, and at several companies. One way you can sort of differentiate yourself and move up the ladder is by developing niche skills. And when I say niche skills, just look at what the hot button topics of today are. Data protection, for example, is very, very sort of up and coming. Everyone's got their focus on it, and everyone wants to, and obviously sort of with GDPR coming into force, there's a heightened sense of importance that's been attached to it. So that's one example of where, if you were to develop your skills in that area, you would be able to sort of move higher up the ladder a lot quicker than your peers.
Yeah. In fact, right now as we speak, in India also the data protection law is going through the churn of getting the final version, and that will have a huge impact for all companies, especially the big corporate giants from the US like Facebook, Amazon and all. They'll be facing I don't say facing the brunt, but they have to adjust to the new reality, and that's what is happening. Another question, slightly digressing from your whatever you told about data protection now, is about, like you said, the head of business is one who would take the final decision, and most of our audience would be working with the key managerial personnel of the companies or the board or the MD. So what are their expectations from a contract lawyer, and how do we fulfill those expectations?
I think the one thing that you tend to lose sight of as a contract lawyer, at least in my experience and sort of based on what I've seen around me, is that we lose sight of our role as a business enabler. And when I say business enabler, at the end of the day, your role is to get the deal across the line. And it's very easy to lose sight of that, and a lot of people sort of just look at risk as, you know, sort of a stumbling block. When a business unit head comes to you, he's looking to you for solutions. At the end of the day, yes, there is a risk, but you need to come up with solution on how to get across those obstacles and get the deal across the line. And I think that's the most important aspect.
So I think that's also, this is what I feel is the benefit of this show, where of course we know about all the basics of contract, but the angle which Anirudh, our guest on today's show, brought is that we can't look at things in isolation, whether you're a contract lawyer or you're specializing in any other law, but you have to look at the overall picture, the big picture. And like he said, the person who, in his case, like the business head, they want to make sure that the business goes to the next level and they sign it. And the role of a contract lawyer is more of an enabler and a facilitator to make sure that we don't lose more time. At the same time, making sure the company is safe and taking care of all the risks. So going further, I wanted to ask you one more thing, is about the future trends in this profession with respect to contract, being a contract lawyer, with the angle and dimension of AI and ML. Everyone is using this word everywhere. Even people who don't know what it is, they're like, AI, ML is going to change the world. Yes, but with respect to contracts, I always used to think that something as simple as a NDA, is it really necessary for a human being with the skills to be there, or is it okay for an automated solution? So what are your views? Will it impact, first thing? And the second thing is, how can you upskill?
Yeah, now I think you've asked a very relevant question. Like with most fields, I feel like lawyering is also ripe for disruption, and especially with AI, sort of being around. A lot of sort of process-related, mundane tasks that lawyers would do, it's very easy for that to be replaced by AI. For example, if you're looking at an NDA that's about 2 or 3 pages long, typically there's not a lot of negotiation that goes into it. Perhaps there's 2 or 3 instances where the client would say, oh, I don't like this specific exception to an NDA, or I don't want it to be 3 years that this NDA needs to be enforced. It needs to be 5 years. So there'd be very simple issues in the NDA that a client would want to change. Now that's something that a machine can easily replace. So I think as a future, that's one thing that a lawyer needs to really watch out for. The fact that don't sort of just look at yourself as someone who just looks at process. Just look at how you can be a differentiator, because if a machine can replace your job, you need to be better than sort of just someone who looks at process in isolation.
And basically what the machine can't do, and that's what you should end up doing.
Yes.
And this is, one, you can stay in denial, but like Anirudh said, that this is something which is round the corner. Disruption will happen. About when or how, it's a matter of time. But that doesn't mean that this is the end of the road for us. But in fact, it's a huge opportunity. Just to draw a reference and example for all our audience who can understand, in 2006, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs in India decided to go online with MCA21. Basically, they were shifting the entire regime of physical filings and physical interface with the regulatory authority to online with the MCA21, and it was developed by TCS and later Infosys. And at that time, when if you were to travel back at 2006, there were many chartered accountants, lawyers, company secretaries who thought this is the end of the profession. In fact, that has been a huge fillip and springboard for the profession to grow. Now there are more professionals, there are more companies, and things are faster, and the opportunities is much higher. So I feel it's something like that with this. There'll be a transition, but your core skills and experience can never be replaced is what I feel.
Absolutely, I agree. I think sort of at the end of the day, your value add is to be able to analyze and sort of spot issues, and that core skill probably is definitely here to stay. But I think sort of where there will be disruption is where there's just pure play process.
Yeah. So I think we're coming to the fag end of our interview, and here I have a question which is very relevant in the coming days, because going forward it won't be that you're working in only one jurisdiction, you'll be working in multiple jurisdictions regardless of your location, your physical location of where you work from. Even a small company now has a overseas investment somewhere, or a foreign company has a FDI investment in India. So you will deal with multiple jurisdictions. So this is a background to the question. The actual question is, I read an article which said that when you want to move really high up the ladder in any profession, your core technical skills contribute to about 15%. Let's say you're the CEO or head of legal of the entire company, and 85% depends on your soft skills and how you understand people and stuff like that. So in this background, since you have to deal with people with different cultures and different countries, what do you think will make you successful as compared to someone who's just a nerd with complete knowledge of the law?
I think so. I recently read a book called it was by an author called Daniel Kahneman, and it is called Emotional Intelligence. And I thought a lot of what was written in the book is relevant to what we do. IQ can take you to a certain extent, but then emotional intelligence really sort of plays such a huge role in your overall success. And I say that because sort of you on a typical day would deal with somebody from Switzerland, somebody from America and somebody from India, and every single culture has their own way of working, and it's important for you to understand it and to be able to pander to it at the end of the day. Because at the end, what's important for us as lawyers is to gain trust. And, if you're able to tap into that emotional intelligence quotient and are able to sort of build trust, that will certainly take you a lot farther than just be able to reel off, sections of the law.
Yeah. So emotional intelligence is the way to go along with your core technical skills. That's the message from our guest Anirudh. So lastly, Anirudh, because most of them who are watching this are somebody who are studying law or CS or CA, they're in that phase of their life, what would your advice be to them if they were interested in being a contract lawyer or specializing in contracts, because it's very close to what they're doing now? They can easily branch out to this.
No, I think there's a whole lot of opportunities out there. I think especially sort of Europe, the US, India, all of these jurisdictions, there's always a need for contract lawyers. Now, in the organizations that I've worked in, the highest number of lawyers that have existed in the legal departments are always contract lawyers. So there's always a need. So I think sort of it is a very exciting time to be in this field. And at the same time, sort of just keep your eyes and ears open. If there are, when I was a student, and you as well, Alok, we used to go and intern in different places, just so that we're able to get the exposure and sort of just get that first foot in the door. And I think that's really important, just getting that practical insight before you sort of do a deep dive.
I think that's something which all of you should do. And what I want everyone to really take out of this interview is that there was a day, even our guest Anirudh saw the contract and he didn't know what to do about it, but now he's dealing with countries and multiple jurisdictions, and he's worked with bigger organizations, and he's moving higher up the ladder in his field. And what I want everyone to really draw attention, and also to make sure that you can also do this, because if you are studying CS or corporate law, every company is looking for a legal counsel, and the first person they look forward to is the company secretary for smaller and mid-sized companies, even if they have a legal team. So that is where you can take a cue and you can start developing your skills and start drafting simple contracts. Like Anirudh told, at least look at the contracts which you're just accepting online, and then you'll be able to develop the skills, and we'll always be there to help you. So please make sure that you leave your comments. If you have further questions, you can leave it in the comments below and we'll be happy to answer. And Anirudh, thanks a lot for making time. Though you had come here on a personal visit, thanks for making time and coming to our show, The Practical Side.
Pleasure. Thank you so much, Alok. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So that was The Practical Side. Our guest was Anirudh Rao, who is a contract lawyer with Cognizant, and he shared his entire experience and the future opportunities in this wonderful field of drafting contracts, vetting contracts, and negotiating contracts. For more such episodes, subscribe to Ekcel Academy and make sure that you understand the practical side of law. Thank you and all the best to you.